Starting right out with macrofauna. So these are the big guys. These are the ones you can see, you can catch, and we will go and catch them. Of course, we have vertebrates and invertebrates. I'm hoping that some of you, this is a third-year course, that some of you have taken vertebrate and or invertebrate zoology and have an idea of this, but if you have, I'm going to do a quick revision for the people who haven't, because I might have some people in here who haven't taken those courses. So the vertebrates include herbivores, like mice, that are mostly eating above ground things, but some of them are in the ground eating leaf litters. And a lot of the vertebrates that are herbivores are cachers. So they're eating seeds above ground and then bringing them below ground and pooping below ground. Chipmunks is a classic example. And then another class of common soil vertebrates are insectivores. So these guys are your top consumers. They're eating herbivores and carnivorous invertebrates. So class examples of this are moles and salamanders. So here's my favorite redback salamander that I always find an excuse to talk about. And the star-nosed mole, which is a very common local mole that looks remarkable. These guys both live in the soil and are eating majority invertebrates. I know we call them insectivores. I guess they're really invertivores, but we specifically call moles insectivores. So the other macrofauna we have are invertebrates. So there's a ton of invertebrates, but I'm going to specifically look at earthworms, ants and termites, and then millipedes, woodlice, and centipedes on some separate slides. Earthworms are possibly the most important macro soil invertebrate. So, and when we talk about macrofauna, earthworms are one of the most important ones. They are detrivores. They're breaking down the organic matter, vegetation, and then other carnivores are eating them. They are not agricultural pests, because we hear this term a lot where you have worms in your broccoli or worms in your corn or a worm in your apple. Those are never actually worms. Those are usually insect larvae of herbivorous insects. But we use the term worm. We used to use the term worm for any creepy crawly, from a dragon to a beetle. If it didn't have legs, it was a worm. But the earthworms that we're going to look at sort of fit into three different categories. So from a soil perspective, we have epigeic, endogeic, and anesic. So these are three words that I'm going to test you on. So learn them. Epigeic worms live on the soil surface. They live in the litter, they eat the litter, they do not burrow. So these are your compost worms, red wigglers, Eisenia fetida. They really hasten decomposition because they're eating out all that litter on top, all your compost, but they're not mixing at all. They're just eating and pooping in situ. Endogeic worms are living and feeding in the soil. So they're making burrows. These are typically horizontal burrows though, so there's not as much mixing going on because they're typically just staying horizontally in that top leaf layer and maybe lower than the epigeic worms, because epigeic worms are really right on the surface and they might go a little bit under. The endogeic worms are in the soil layers eating the smaller things. And then our last category are the anisic worms. So these are your typical night crawlers, and they're very important because they build permanent vertical burrows. They crawl up and feed on the surface at nighttime typically. That's why we call them night crawlers. And then they carry the food they find back down their burrows. And in the daytime, they're deep in their burrows. They can eat the food that they carry down there, or they can sleep safely. You can actually hear these worms at night crawling around and eating if you listen really closely. So this is the common earthworm that you've probably been exposed to, that is in your garden, that if you're an angler, you might have put on a hook before. And they're really important mixers because they're taking surface material down their vertical burrows through the layers of soil. What's really interesting is all of these worms, particularly those anisic nightcrawler earthworms, are invasive. These worms were all wiped out by the glaciers. So wherever North America was covered in glaciers, there haven't been worms since those glaciers retreated. So the boreal forests of northern Ontario are adapted to a no worms. So they have a very stratified soil because they don't have as many earthworms mixing it up. And this means the plants, for example, trilliums is one that people frequently talk about when they're talking about stratification of soil. They're adapted to a really thick leaf layer. Bunchberry is another really common one. They grow in that thick leaf layer. That's what they're adapted to. When you add these earthworms to it, they hasten the decomposition and the mixing of the soil, and it makes it more difficult for the native flora to live in that soil. This is such a problem that the state of Minnesota has instituted a worm watch. So all over, you can, if you live anywhere on the Great Lakes, you can report this, but Minnesota specifically has an amazing park system. The Boundary Waters that borders on Quetico Provincial Park is a very popular camping and very remote camping situation, backcountry paddling, and Minnesota is very proud of it and protects it, and the people that paddle it have a great community. And what they've noticed is fishermen bring in worms to use as bait and then often release those worms at the campsite, not thinking about the fact that they're invasive. Worms are everywhere. Why would it matter if I dump them on the campsite? And they're actually having a problem with these worms at campsites. So they're starting a worm watch. Here in Ontario, in North Bay, we typically don't see earthworms deep in the forest. But the problem here is you do see them wherever there's humans and wherever there's farms. So if there was a farmstead and then a forest is grown over top, there might be some earthworms there. It depends on the situation, but realistically, you're going to find a lot of worms in your garden. You might not find a lot of worms in the forest behind your garden. So this is just showing the layers of stratified soil in a typical boreal forest. Very stratified, not a lot of mixing. A very thick organic layer at the top, which is that LFH layer, and a bit of that AH. And then the orange at the bottom is a mineral layer. So things that earthworms don't like is acidic soil. So this is one of the reasons why they haven't been too invasive into the boreal forest, is because the Forests dominated by conifer trees tend to be quite acidic. Soils dominated with bedrock tend to be quite acidic. They're more common in limestone soils because they need that calcium. This is very different than enchytraeid worms, little white potworms. We'll talk about them in another slide. They really like acidic conditions. Other things that are bad for earthworms, obviously predators. Lots of things eat earthworms. It's probably the reason we have so many robins in our cities, because we have so many earthworms here for them. They really don't like ammonia fertilizers. They're not very good where you're tilling the ground a lot. So you tend to have them low in areas where there's intense agriculture. In your garden in your backyard, you're really only tilling that earth maybe once in the spring, if that, whereas a farm is mechanically tilling it and is less likely to have those earthworms. They also really don't like sand. Sand microscopically has a lot of coarse, sharp grains that will scratch them and cut them, for the same reason that humans don't want to get sand in their shoes. Worms don't want sand all over their soft skin. So, moving on to ants and termites. These guys are famous ecosystem engineers. Ants and termites both build extensive nests. So ant nests are underground mazes. I should find a video and post it. There's a video floating around online where they pour metal into an ant nest and then dig it up so you can see just how large the ant nest is. I will try and find that for you guys. But that allows better water infiltration into the soil. They're aerating the soil. They're making the soil more porous. They also modify the soil pH. Ants make acidic chemicals. If you've ever been bitten by an ant, I think it's called formicin. It's an acid that is quite potent. And they encourage the growth of nitrogen-fixing microbes. Most ants and all termites will grow little colonies underground. So some ants are stashing the food they eat underground to eat later. Some are purposely growing things that they will eat, like little farmers. Termites are amazing in the mounds that they can build. Termite mounds are a whole other ecosystem. Birds nest in termite mounds. Animals live in termite mounds. Termites are pretty impressive. They also have a really cool relationship with their gut flora, which allows them to digest cellulose. So this means that they can eat wood and actually get nutrients out of wood fibers. Cellulose and lignin are two very hard to digest fibers, and only bacteria can really do it. So it takes a long time for cellulose to be digested, unless it gets into a termite's belly. When we talk about greenhouse gases, which I do a lot because I teach environmental science, we frequently talk about cows being our big methane producer, because the oil and gas industry only make about 20% of our methane production, whereas cows produce, it depends on who you talk to, but 30 to 40%. So you can see down here, manure is 4%, it's in purple. That big orange slice, enteric fermentation, that's like cellulose digesting in ruminant stomachs. So like cow stomachs, goat stomachs. That is a huge chunk. And something I didn't know until I started looking into methane production, that rice cultivation, it produces a lot of methane, which makes sense because in the natural sense, wetlands are our biggest methane producer. So if humans didn't exist, wetlands produce the majority of methane. All of the vegetation sitting in these anaerobic environments, digesting. And if you've ever poked a stick or stepped into a bog or a swamp and smelt those sulfurous gases coming up, you know about how methane is produced in wetlands. But termites produce a good chunk of about 4 to 5% of global emissions of methane. So before humans existed, that was a substantial amount of methane that was being produced, which is pretty cool. More than cows. I guess there's more termites than there are cows. Yeah, ants and termites are like some of the most abundant critters on the planet. There's so many animals that eat nothing but ants and termites. Like start thinking about how many birds eat nothing but ants and termites, how many mammals eat nothing but ants and termites. It's pretty impressive. Anyway, moving on. Millipedes and centipedes. These critters are very different and yet very similar. So a lot of people get them mixed up. Millipedes are herbivores. Centipedes are carnivores. And not just carnivores, they're hunters. They're venomous. They hunt down and bite their prey, put poison into them, venom. They're like, if centipedes were larger, we'd all be scared of them. When trying to tell them apart, millipedes are rounder and they have 2 legs per segment. So they move very differently than a centipede. That they have this sort of wave of the way their legs move. I love holding a centipede in my hand and feeling it crawl and watching it crawl. Centipedes are typically flatter and they only have 1 leg per segment. So they move differently. These are pictures of the most common millipedes and centipedes found in the North Bay area. Typically, I find millipedes when I lift dead logs, and I find centipedes when I lift anything. When I lift dead logs in the forest, I find centipedes, but I have a lot of them in my garden. I think they're eating the woodlice. They might be eating anything. But whenever I lift a brick or a chair, I usually find centipedes. I do want to take a moment to talk about house centipedes because I grew up in North Bay and did not experience house centipedes. We don't have them up here, but my friends in Toronto have these things, and I find them very scary. My sister now lives in Kingston and she has them there too. They're originally from Mexico and they've worked their way up with climate change. We now have warm environments for them in your house year round. They like damp areas. That's probably because there's more food for them. A lot of critters like damp places. They dry out. They're susceptible to drought. Their skin needs the moisture. They're very fast. They are not a pest, though. If you have a centipede, they're eating the pests in your home. The centipedes won't hurt your house. They won't give you diseases. They won't eat your food. They won't eat your walls. They will eat the things that will give you diseases and eat your walls. So despite the fact that they are one of the creepiest critters I have ever encountered. They are the good guys. Kind of like spiders, right? Spiders are eating the things that are eating your house. That brings us to woodlice. These are really cool because they're one of the few crustaceans that are completely adapted to terrestrial life. This is the only crustacean that we will see, this group are the only crustaceans that we will see that do not live aquatically at any points, right? So crabs can come on land, but they are associated with water. All crustaceans are associated with water except for a number. We call them all woodlice. They get mixed up a lot. I'm going to use the term pillbug and sowbug, but there are so many names for these. My sister married a Newfoundlander and lived in Newfoundland for a decade, and they call them carpenters. I don't know why, but that's what they're called there. So to distinguish between the two, sowbugs have their feet sort of pushing them up a little bit, and they can roll into a ball. So we call those ones pillbugs, the ones with their feet underneath that roll up into a ball. This is like in the bug's life, the roly-polies, like they have the two that don't speak English that are like acrobats. Those are pillbugs or roly-polies. And then I'm going to call the other ones sowbugs. So these guys are flatter. They have two tail appendages, and I find that one of the better ID features are those two little tail appendages that come off. And they typically have 7 sets of legs, but you're not really counting their legs. The sowbugs are really common in North Bay. This is the one you've probably seen. The pillbugs are less common. But depending on where you're from, you might have seen both. You might have both under a rock in your garden right now. And you probably have names for them other than sowbug and pillbug. But these guys are not harmful. They're detrivores. They're only eating dead, decaying matter. Sometimes they'll eat some tender grass shoots that are coming up under a log that they're living under. But if they're in their house, they're not hurting your house. And if they're in your garden, they're not hurting your garden. And they're probably feeding a lot of other